Now we are online. Oi, gente, boa noite. Estamos começando aqui mais um DigiLabour Conversations, hoje com a participação do Jathan Sadowski, que é professor na Monash University, na Austrália. Ele que é autor do livro Too Smart, como que o capitalismo digital está extraindo dados, controlando as nossas vidas e tomando conta do mundo. Ele é autor também de textos que a gente tem lido bastante no Brasil, como Dados como Forma de Capital e a Internet dos Senhores da Terra. O tema da live de hoje é Work Smarter and Harder. E it is a great pleasure to have us today in Australia and in Brazil, Jathan. Hi, nice to meet you.
Great to meet you too. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, you can start your talk about 30 minutes, and then we can ask some questions to you.
Great. Let me share my screen. All right, that should be sharing now. And yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be part of the DigiLabour Conversation series. As I was telling Rafael, he's done such a great job of gathering together a whole community of really interesting scholars and activists and people thinking about these things. So I'm happy to give a talk here on Work Smarter and Harder. And this talk is derived from my new book, as Rafael was saying, called Too Smart. And so really going to try to explore some of the threads tying together the industrial workplace with the smart workplace and show that these two things are not so disconnected as they might seem. So I'll go ahead and get started. The classic Charlie Chaplin film Modern Times, made in 1936, is a brilliant satire of what the opening scene calls a story of industry of individual enterprise. The film depicts the dehumanizing nature of industrial society and shows how mechanical innovations were used to increase efficiency and maximize exploitation. Even though the film was made over 80 years ago, with just some simple updates to the job and the technology involved, it could very easily be about today. So the film starts with Chaplin. As a hapless worker in a factory, we see various parts of his grueling workday. The boss oversees everybody by flipping through screens installed all around the factory. And the screens are these two-way videos. They not only allow the boss to monitor the whole factory from his office, but also show the workers that the boss is watching. This type of surveillance might bring to mind George Orwell's 1984. But that was published 13 years after Chaplin's film, so Modern Times kind of preempted it. The scene then cuts to Chaplin, who is working on an assembly line. The speed of the machine, as we see here, often outpaces him, forcing him to work double time just to keep up. But soon Chaplin clocks out for a break and goes to the toilets, hoping to get a brief moment alone to rest, grab a cigarette, sit down. But shortly after catching his breath, a monitor in the toilet switches on and the boss yells at Chaplin, "Hey, quit stalling and get back to work." The whistle blows for lunchtime. We see a group of inventors pitching a new labor-saving technology to the boss called the feeding machine. They just need a guinea pig to demonstrate it in action. The boss chooses Chaplin to give it a go. An engineer describes the machine as, quote, "a practical device which automatically feeds your men while at work. Don't stop for lunch. Be ahead of your competitor." End quote. The feeding machine will eliminate the lunch hour, increase your production, and decrease your overhead. Chaplin is strapped into the machine and force-fed while he works on the assembly line. Now he can multitask, work and eat at the same time. But soon the machine malfunctions, pummeling him with its mechanical arms and shoving food into his face. Not every innovation is perfect after all. So fast forward near the end of the workday, Chaplin is exhausted, but still working on the assembly line. And in a desperate attempt to keep up with the rapid pace of the conveyor belt, Chaplin gets pulled into the machine. In one of the most famous scenes of the movie, Chaplin is seen getting crushed by its massive gears that push him through the churning insides of the machine as if he's being chewed and digested by a mechanical monster. All that's missing is a label on the machine that reads "Industrial Capitalism." His fellow workers throw the machine into reverse and it spits Chaplin back out. Battered and fatigued, Chaplin suffers a nervous breakdown, and the boss has the police haul him off to the hospital, just another casualty of capitalism. So Modern Times ingeniously satired work and life in industrial society. Even today, it remains a masterful film, one worth watching. But if we made a sequel called Contemporary Times about work in a smart society, what would it look like? Instead of a factory in the 1930s, perhaps it would be set in the early 21st century version of a brutal, exploitative workplace. An Amazon warehouse, for example. By now, everybody listening is probably familiar with the infamously terrible working conditions in Amazon warehouses around the world. But it's worth setting the scene and reminding ourselves what this side of digital labor looks like. It's these warehouses, whether filled with shelves of products or servers of data, which are the arteries of the digital economy, the engine that keeps it running. We really cannot understand digital labor if we don't recognize the ways in which it is extremely material and spatial, and thus still relies on the type of logistics and infrastructures that would be familiar to industrial capital and labor. But now it's been upgraded, made smarter to maximize control and exploitation. The warehouse is a colossal, cavernous, concrete structure. Inside are multiple floors filled with endless rows of shelves. Conveyor belts cut through the warehouse, carrying boxes to different stations. Depending on the season of the year, the warehouse is either sweltering hot or freezing cold. The large loading bay doors are kept shut for fear of employees stealing items. The same fear means that everybody is searched, like they're at an airport, before going to the cafeteria, toilets, or leaving for the day, waiting in security lines for as long as 30 minutes, without pay, of course. All the pickers are equipped with a handheld computer, which issues commands to the worker, telling them what items must be retrieved and where it is in the massive warehouse. The device then counts down the seconds left for the picker to find and scan the correct item. If the item isn't found in time, then the picker's rate of success falls. If the rate dips low enough, then the worker is fired and replaced by a new hire, and the cycle begins again. According to reports, in 1 year at a single Amazon warehouse, roughly 300 full-time associates were terminated for inefficiency. In a depressing portrait of digital capitalism's cruelty, productivity quotas are valued so highly and humans so lowly that the tracking system automatically terminates workers without input from supervisors based on their performance. So if workers cannot be automated out of a job, then their managers will be. If you happen to work in one of the warehouses outfitted with Kiva robotics, then a section of the warehouse will be termed a, quote, human exclusion zone, where a swarm of robotic platforms move shelves around in a networked choreography. This zone is dark, quiet, and off limits. Any human who gets in the way could be seriously injured, and perhaps more importantly, for Amazon's bottom line, disrupt the system's careful coordination of moving shelves. Descriptions of the human exclusion zones have a Lovecraftian vibe. It's the surreal horror of an abyss where unpredictable robots reign, occasionally emerging from the darkness, only to recede back into the quiet swarm. The smart tech deployed in the warehouse is not designed to make the job easier or complement people's skills and abilities. It is more like a handheld overseer that barks orders, tracks productivity, cracks the whip, and terminates any slackers. Every second is monetized, every movement is monitored and optimized. Accruing mere moments or mere minutes of unproductive activity is an offense that must be weeded out. Companies call these infractions time theft because when employees are on the clock, the company owns every second of their lives. Even going to the toilet too often by the company standards is grounds for disciplinary action. On the flip side, companies never discuss the plentiful instances of wage theft, like waiting in security lines before and after clocking out. There is no room for error and no time for less than peak performance. Amazon calculates the minimum numbers of bodies working at the maximum productivity needed to meet its demanding targets. And that's the number of people hired. Workers are typically expected to pick over 1,000 items in a 10-hour shift, which means walking, or very often jogging, an estimated 12 to 15 miles while constantly crouching, standing, and reaching on tippy toes. Amazon seems like an extreme example of using smart tech to exploit and control its workers. And it's true that the company's practices are egregious, but they are far from the exception. For instance, in 2013, the British supermarket Tesco was accused of equipping employees with armbands that monitored their every move, timed their task, and scored their productivity, much like this image here, which is taken from an Amazon patent. The number of people subjected to such working conditions is massive. Amazon alone employs hundreds of thousands of people worldwide, and it's still growing. The first fulfillment center, as they call their warehouses in Australia, where I'm at now, opened only in 2017. Rather than an outlier, Amazon is the vanguard, leading the way in how to use smart tech in workplaces and on workers. One report on Amazon's labor practices calls the company an aggressive trendsetter. Similar kinds of smart tech, used for the same reasons of managing and squeezing employees, have been deployed in a great variety of jobs. It's not just limited to those working in warehouse or manual labor. If you work on the computer for a living, in an office job, for example, which is probably all of us right now, or many of us at least, there's a range of tools that enable managers to scrutinize their employees' every action. These include so-called productivity tools, such as WorkSmart, which bosses can install on your computer to not only capture regular screenshots, but also use the webcam to take a picture every 10 minutes. They then use this, plus other data, to come up with a focus score and an intensity score that can be used to assess the value of workers and freelancers. At this point, it's probably best just to assume the boss is reading your email, checking your web activity, scanning your social media, perhaps even tracking your keystrokes. If they're not doing it personally, then at least algorithmically. And possibly, they're doing this not only while you're at work. This type of productivity monitoring, as it is euphemistically called, is becoming the norm. Smarter tech for bigger profits and better control. How else will the boss make sure you're not slacking off while working from home? Considering the current circumstances with the pandemic and with the surge of everybody working from home, this now includes essentially everybody. The sale of such employee monitoring software has been surging. If you look at the website of many of the companies offering such tools, they'll oftentimes involve COVID-19 or coronavirus or pandemic directly in their marketing copy. They're advertising, knowing that employers are looking for ways to keep an eye on and discipline employees while at work. But this isn't merely, or while they're working from home, rather, but this isn't merely taking the kinds of things that a boss would do while you're, say, in the office and applying it to while you're working from home. It allows the managers a different degree and a different type of power, one that they could never have access to without these tools. I mean, not even the most nosy, over-your-shoulder manager could literally keep perfect records of your activity at all times. There are countless examples of how employers wield smart technology to extract more value from employees and exert more control over them. The smart self works harder, better, faster, longer, and the boss wants more. Take the ruthless greed at the heart of capitalism, add constant surveillance and authoritarian algorithms, mix well with systemic inequality and precarious employment, and you have a recipe for labor in contemporary times. We spend most of our waking life working. Our sense of self-esteem and identity is intimately tied to our jobs. Our autonomy is at the mercy of companies that can dictate what we do and when we do it. The philosopher Elizabeth Anderson likens employers to, quote, private governments with sweeping authoritarian powers over our lives, on duty and off, end quote. That level of influence over our lives means we cannot understand what it means to be smart without confronting the working conditions of a smart society. While smart technology grants us new conveniences and capabilities, it also extends that power many times over to other interested parties. Consider the rise of personal self-tracking devices. We can closely study our own habits, establish regimens of self-improvement, outsource discipline to the device, and achieve our goals with personalized assistance. At the same time, in the hands of bosses, the ability to monitor and modify behavior can be directed to other ends. Employers can enact brutal demands over workers in warehouses and home offices alike. Each worker's productivity can be measured and compared against performance goals, thus revealing every worker's real worth to the company. Each action can be assessed to ensure it is the most efficient use of time and energy. And through constant surveillance, employers can prevent and punish so-called time theft by workers who are not maximally productive. The smart workplace is optimized to slash cost, control employees, and wring sense wherever possible. Until their jobs can be fully automated, since machines don't ask for wages, benefits, or holidays, workers are effectively treated as flesh and blood robots. In other words, it's the same power dynamic of class struggle that has driven innovation for centuries. And I've only given you a sample of where it has led us. 50 years ago, Harry Braverman wrote in his landmark book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, quote, in addition to the technical function of increasing the productivity of labor, machinery also has in the capitalist system the function of divesting the mass of workers of their control over their own labor, end quote. If you had told me this statement was written about, say, 5G and Industry 4.0, I would totally believe you. Of course, it's not the robots who are taking our jobs, it's the capitalist use of machinery, of data, networks, and automation, which is displacing jobs and immiserating working conditions. The robots have no say in how they are designed and for what purposes they are implemented. Those decisions are made by the owners of capital and the managers of production. What we are seeing now is not so much a radical break, contrary to what the Silicon Valley thought leaders will tell us, but rather the latest phase in a long history of capitalist technopolitics. Marx pointed out 150 years ago that the workplace and the exploitation of one class by another inspires an infinite variety of ingenious and inhumane innovation. So I want to end this talk by thinking about what resistance to the system of digital labor might entail. The workplace is defined by a lack of autonomy and privacy in a way that's unlike almost any other social relationship in most people's lives, setting aside, for example, prison or maybe grade school. Yet, quote, even in this exploitative ecosystem, workers still find ways to push back and reclaim some autonomy through acts of micro-resistance. As Adam Barr, a writer who worked at a picker for the large UK grocery store Sainsbury's, explained, Barr describes a few different ways that pickers, for instance, loosen the grip of their algorithmic bosses and make their jobs more bearable. These include staying logged into the handset during lunch breaks so that, quote, the average weekly pick rate plummets, causing the algorithm to set a lower target. Or leaving the device, quote, slightly off its charging station at the end of the shift so that it would run out of a charge a few hours into the next shift, thus securing a 5 or 10 minute break during the next shift while the manager finds a replacement. In such cases, it is better to be reprimanded for human error than to fully submit to the yoke of algorithmic supervision. These acts of micro-resistance may seem insignificant, but each one can have a meaningful effect on individual morale, and collectively, they can sway the value proposition of new technology. If workers are busy devising ways of gaming the system rather than succumbing to profit maximization, then the investment for employers may not be worthwhile. Micro-resistance highlights a dynamic at the heart of capitalism's evolution, from the Industrial Revolution to the smart society. Finding ways to squeeze more value from workers is, as I said earlier, a powerful motivation for innovation. But in response, workers have always searched for ways to slow down the pace of work, reclaim some of the value they produce, and exercise their human agency. In 1917, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a labor leader with the Industrial Workers of the World and a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union, published a pamphlet called Sabotage, the conscious withdrawal of the workers' industrial efficiency. Sabotage perfectly describes how workers like Adam Barr, a century later, found ways to disrupt the tyranny of efficiency as enforced by their handheld managers. Adding grit and friction to an exploitative system designed to be frictionless is good practice. I argue that resisting the machinery of digital capitalism must take seriously the tradition of tactical sabotage. Just as there are clear through lines connecting the imperatives of industrial capitalism with those of digital capitalism, so too must we continue to draw inspiration from the history of worker resistance and labor solidarity. These practices are not merely artifacts from the past, they continue to be relevant and necessary today. I will leave you all with a passage from Flynn's pamphlet. Quote, I have not given you a rigidly defined thesis on sabotage because sabotage is in the process of making. Sabotage itself is not clearly defined. Sabotage is as broad and changing as industry, as flexible as the imagination and passions of humanity. Every day, working men and women are discovering new forms of sabotage, and the stronger their rebellious imagination is, the more sabotage they are going to invent, the more sabotage they are going to develop. Sabotage is not, however, a permanent weapon. Sabotage is not going to be necessary once a free society has been established. I explore that issue of sabotage, resistance, and what it means to live in a smart society in my new book here. And I thank you all for listening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jathan. It's amazing. We have some questions to you. The first from Marcos Mendes is, oops. Okay. AI, artificial intelligence, is inevitable. How can we guarantee that this tech is to serve the people and not slave?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I would push back a little bit to say that while these things often feel inevitable, they're certainly not, right? Because they are ultimately the product of human decisions and social relationships. What makes them feel inevitable is the strength of those power relationships and those social structures, and the seeming inability to resist them, to redirect them to different ends. But as I've tried to talk about at the end of my presentation, I think that there are ways to do that. And it requires a kind of collective saying, this is not what we want artificial intelligence, for example, to be used for. So I would say that if we accept that proposition that it's inevitable, then that automatically and instantly kind of undermines our own ability to redirect or change what it means. Instead, it's like I said in my talk, where it's not robots taking our job, it's capital making decisions about what innovations to use, which are then being used to displace people from their jobs, right? So I think by simply understanding that really crucial and seemingly simple insight that technology is the product of social choice and human decisions, that gets us such a long way to redirecting what something like artificial intelligence means right now.
Okay. The next question is, how two smart technologies affect universities, including in the pandemic?
Yeah, so there's definitely these kinds of technologies. So like these employee monitoring tools that I've talked about, where managers and bosses are using them to monitor employees that are working from home. I mean, these kinds of things are perfectly applied to a university setting, to looking at staff and so on. I do think that unlike say the industrial sectors or the more kind of outright corporate sectors, universities have been better in my experience as far as like not saddling their staff with those kinds of tools. But what they have done instead is use them on students, which I think is where in the university sector the attention needs to be directed. And they're oftentimes under the excuse of say like anti-cheating or monitoring people's attention and engagement levels during lectures and classes and tests and things like that. And that kind of excuse uses the same reasoning as bosses saying, oh, it's for productivity or to ensure that people aren't doing time theft, things like that. But instead, what it does is it saddles students who are already going through a really tough time, already trying to adjust to new ways of learning, new ways of doing schoolwork, and oftentimes at the same time themselves having to work, have families, or just simply deal with the stress of living in this time with all the troubles and hardship that comes with it. And to saddle them, to use these technologies on them, to keep them more surveilled, more monitored, to keep them kind of yoked or strapped to these online learning platforms, for example. And oftentimes these platforms are themselves for-profit companies, these kind of ed tech or education technology platforms that now dominate universities. That's where these kinds of too smart technologies are being used. So I think what we need is more kind of solidarity with the students, more attention to the experience of students and how they are having to deal with these kinds of technologies.
Okay, thanks. Gabriel asks, recently you said that data capital is different from, but has roots in economic capital. Could you go a little bit further on this, how it applied to the logic of working smarter and harder?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is that I want to. So economic capital is money. I mean, to just put it really bluntly, right? It's money, but also things like machinery as well is oftentimes talked about as a form of fixed capital. But I want to disconnect that a little bit to say that data and money are not interchangeable with each other, right? So what that means is that the collection of data is not always done like you would with a natural resource which you are trying to turn into money somehow, whether that's through advertising or by selling it onto a secondary market. That is part of it. I mean, there are definitely companies that are doing that and making a lot of money doing it. I mean, places like Google, for example, get most of their revenue from advertising still. However, data can also be used to produce other things other than money, other than exchanging it into money. It can be used to create new goods and services. It can be used to improve the efficiency of existing machines, but it can also be used for some of the examples that I talked about in my presentation around power and worker control. We often forget that, yes, there's a profit imperative and this kind of accumulation of or imperative to maximize profit in capitalism, and companies definitely are driven forward by that. But there's also an imperative to maintain power, to maintain control over the labor force. And sometimes decisions about controlling labor, about maintaining that power over the workforce, supersede or override decisions about maximizing profit. I think if we keep the theme of tying it back to the of industrial capitalism. The historian David F. Noble, in his 1976, somewhere around there, book, Forces of Production, looks at what he calls the social choice in machine design. And he gives a really great example of these early versions of automated numeric control machine working technologies, and how there were choices made where there were different options, and one option would have given a more profitable outcome for the companies that were making these decisions about how to design the machines. But another option would have given more power and control over the workforce by de-skilling these highly specialized machine operators and allowing them to kind of break apart the expertise in the workforce, and thus allowing managers to have more control over workers. And that was the option they went with. So they sacrificed some profit in order to de-skill and have more managerial power over employers. And I think that's a key difference in thinking about how data capital is different. It's not always about profit. It's not always about money. Sometimes it's about other uses of data and using it as this form of capital.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Claudia Nossolini Rebecca. Jathan, in your new book, you say that technological determinism contributes to the development of digital capitalism. Please talk about it.
Yeah, so this myth, which I talked about in my response to the first question, this kind of myth of technological determinism, which is this idea that technologies move forward in a linear way, right? They can only move forward in one way. They're always moving towards progress, and they're doing so outside of the influence of human society, of human decision. This myth of technological determinism is purpose-built for contributing to the advancement of digital capitalism and capitalism in general. I mean, Marx talks about this as well. So going back 150 years ago, because it gives this idea that the ways in which technologies and innovations are being built and for whose interests they are materializing, who's benefiting from them, who's able to access the technologies. All of that is natural. It's the best way. It's inevitable to use from the first question. And if that's the case, then it also, by extension, makes the system creating these technologies, capitalism, also feel or seem to be natural and inevitable and even the best way or the only way forward. So this myth, it's this red herring, right? It causes us to pay attention to the technology but miss completely all of the things that are inside of and behind that technology, all of the structures, all of the from the class struggle to interest to the imperatives of profit or collection or control, all of these things that influence how these innovations are actually designed and who gets to use them. If we pay attention only to the technology, we completely miss the structure. We miss the system, which is the kind of material foundation of this myth.
Okay, Jathan, thank you very much. The next question from Camila is on chat about smart cities and platform urbanism. If you can comment on this phenomenon from this point of view of communication research.
Yeah. So, right. So as Camila is saying, I talk in my work about the kind of, as she puts it, the construction of narratives about smart cities. And I quote, I think the phenomenon is similar to the way that neoliberal society builds workers who accept, reproduce, and even defend this model of highly supervised and explorative work. And I think that's exactly right, Camila. I mean, I think there's so much of this kind of like narrative building and building these imaginaries. And this is great because it links directly to the previous question. It's these kinds of myths that we build. And yeah, so in my work on smart cities and platform urbanism, this kind of use of these technologies in urban planning and urban society, urban economies, a lot of how that is sold to us, that kind of selling smartness, as I call it in my work, is about constructing a narrative, which is about creating this this imaginary, as it's called. It's this kind of vision of what the future can and will be like. And by controlling the narrative, by establishing the kinds of definitions for what digital labor or smart cities mean, these companies are able to create the space for their solutions, for their framings of the problem, right? So if we understand the problem of the smart city, for example, as a problem of efficiency, as a problem of optimization, then which is how companies like IBM and Cisco, Google, so on, sell their sell their wares. If we understand the problems of the city in this way, then it presupposes or predetermines the kinds of solutions that we need to solve those problems. And they just happen to be the solutions that these companies are selling. And so it creates this perfect space, right? It also links up to the way that data, for example, I talk about in my book and in my work on data as capital, that companies like IBM talk about it being a universe of data, right? They've constructed everything as made of data or potentially being turned into data, which how convenient that they are the ones with the technologies and the knowledge for extracting and exploiting that data to its maximum ability, to its maximum use. It constructs them as what Tom Wolfe called in the 80s, talking about Wall Street as the new masters of the universe, right? They're the masters of the universe of data. And so these kinds of narratives are really, really powerful because it links directly to the material forms of the world, the material foundations of the world. They don't just come out of nowhere, right? They come out of our minds, out of people's decisions about how to shape and reshape and form the world. And so if you can create a narrative about what the world will look like, then you can make that into a reality today, this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think there's a lot of work there with looking at the ways in which communication and discourses and narratives link directly to this kind of materiality of labor and work and technology.
Oops, my microphone. Thank you very much. Now my question, could you talk a little more about biopolitical platforms? Can you hear?
About what platform? Sorry.
Biopolitical platform.
Oh yes. Yeah, so this is some of my work with Karen Gregory, who's at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, on what we've called biopolitical platforms. And this is based on some of the, particularly based on some of the empirical work that she's been doing with delivery writers, kind of doing interviews and observations and talking to them, as well as kind of analyzing how the platform of Deliveroo in particular works. But what we've talked about as kind of biopolitical platform is understanding these labor platforms as a way of governing people's lives, but in this almost really kind of this deep way, in the sense of creating forms of subjectivity or creating what we call perverse virtues. Now, we call them virtues because it's not only about how people behave or the kinds of relationships that they have, but it's also about how they view themselves, the kinds of characteristics and attributes that they take on in order to, and we call them perverse because it's virtuous from the point of view of the platform, not virtuous from the point of view of what's best for the worker or what leads to a more fulfilling or life or to well-being, but from the point of view of the platform. So we talk about things like flexibility, which are often how these platforms like Deliveroo or Uber or so on and so forth, they always sell their services as being about flexibility. You can work anywhere from at any time, you get to choose. But as we've learned from Karen's empirical work and other people's work on this, flexibility becomes this trap. So people kind of take on, they embody this idea of being the ultimately flexible worker, but it's always flexible for the benefit of the platform, right? Another one we talk about is something like legibility. So being legible to the platform, so being able to be recorded, to take in the kind of rapid feedback of the platform that's telling you where to go, when to go, how to get there, and so on and so forth. So kind of being super responsive and reactive to the platform is another one of these perverse virtues that we talk about. So we describe, we devise this idea of biopolitical platform as a kind of application of the work from people like Michel Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, to the ways in which these kinds of governance regimes, which are really about their bio in the sense of biology, the body, the self, but also life, right? They're about kind of creating these new subjectivities, these new ways of understanding yourself, of being in the world, of creating attributes and virtues and characteristics. But they're being done by these digital platforms, using things like data capital, using things like algorithmic analysis and tracking and so on and so forth, in this really kind of, again, linking the way that I linked in my talk to industrial capitalism. This very much links the kind of operation of these platforms to the older forms of governance that Foucault talks about as biopolitics. So just showing that there isn't this kind of clear break, but rather a kind of constant thread in how political economy and governance and social relations operate, even with these new smart technologies.
Okay, Jathan. Thanks. The next question from Gabriel on our chat. Do you think that this new form of capitalism is somehow taking democracies to its limits, linked to data capitalism?
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely been a big issue that we've heard a lot about, right? Is the way in which things like misinformation, for example, kind of contribute to this crisis of democracy, the ways in which these companies have this just like this monopolistic power, and it's not just limited to the technology sector, right? I mean, they stretch very much into the realm of politics and government, and so I would say that yes, I mean, in short, yes, for sure. These technologies have massive impact for democracy, and not only in this kind of sense of like what we think of as democracy in terms of like voting or government. That's definitely part of it, but also democracy in terms of how we make choices and who gets to make choices about the kinds of things that structure and shape our life. And I talk about this in my book, drawing from the work of Langdon Winner, of political theorist and philosopher of technology, who talks about technology as a form of legislation. And he didn't just mean this in a kind of metaphorical sense, or in a sense that like, oh, technology is in need of regulation and policy. I mean, yes, that's for sure. That's part of it. But what he meant is that technology operates like legislation in the sense that it forms the structure of society in our life. It creates abilities and inabilities for what we can and can't do, for what's possible and what's not possible. So in that way, technology is like law, and so, but it's also very clearly a form of oligarchic legislation, in the sense that there's a small group of wealthy, elite, powerful people, executives, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, engineers at high levels. Those are the people who make decisions about what kinds of technologies are made, for what reasons, for whom, and so on. It's not all of us. We have to live with the decisions that they make, right? We can protest and we can get, new updates or new features or whatever. And we see this with, for example, Zoom, which we're meeting on right now. Because of kind of, a little bit of public outrage about their lack of privacy and security, they've had to make some concessions, but that's about it, right? I mean, we get to make decisions about things after they're made, if we're lucky. And so this is another crisis of democracy that I think we oftentimes don't think about or don't talk about, and we definitely don't consider it in the same way that we do the crisis of democracy in the sense of government and politics. And it's not to say that that's not important. It obviously very much is, in Brazil, in the US, all around the world. But I also want us to understand that technopolitics requires us to look at both technology and politics not as kind of separate things, but is connected, right? There's that hyphen there, it's technopolitics, because they are very much connected with each other. And so if we live with a kind of crisis, a kind of lack of democracy in technology and a lack of democracy in politics, those things are not coincidences. They're not incidental. They tell us something about the structures of power in our society. And addressing one means addressing the whole system.
Okay, thanks. The next question from me is, some people say that platform capitalism has something of refeudalization or pre-capitalism. What do you think about it?
About what do I think about platform capitalism?
And refeudalization.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yes, it's a very awkward phrase, refeudalization. Yeah. So in other words, is it kind of bringing us back to a feudal time period? This kind of lords and serfs and so on. And I kind of argue against that way of understanding it, this kind of like neo-feudal for analysis or critique of platforms, because ultimately, as I argue in one of my recent papers, The Internet of Landlords, I don't understand this as a kind of disconnect from capitalism, but rather as a new form of rentier capitalism. Right. So, but crucially, the point there is that it still very much is part of the operations of capital and the operations of capitalism. Now, I think so that's implicitly or kind of explicitly arguing against two different ways of understanding this that have become pretty popular. So one is this neo-feudal, right? That this thing, platform capitalism and the way platforms operate, is now taking us backwards. It's no longer capitalism. It's going backwards to being feudal in its relationships. So in that way, it's outside of capitalism, or it's kind of evolved past capitalism by looping back around. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, which has become very popular with those who understand surveillance capitalism in the way that Shoshana Zuboff does, is that she understands surveillance capitalism as an aberration of normal capitalism. So for her, the problem with surveillance capitalism is not the capitalism part, it's the surveillance part. She thinks capitalism can be perfectly fine and just. And the problem is that we now have companies like Google and Facebook that have created an unjust form of capitalism through surveillance. And I completely disagree with that as well, because I think both forms, Zuboff explicitly and the neo-feudal argument implicitly, kind of let capitalism off the hook, right? They say, well, the attention is not to be put on capitalism, the dominant structure in the world, in the global economy. The attention needs to put on a bad form of capitalism or something that's not capitalism. And I think that kind of impulse to look at it as if it's something new almost falls into the Silicon Valley rhetoric of disruption, that this is unlike anything that's come before it, right? That's not the case. When I argue it's a form of rentier capitalism, what I'm trying to do is relate it back to long-standing relationships between landlords and those who not just own property or sell things, but control access to a good or service, right? That's all a landlord is, right? They own your house, or they own the land, and they charge you rent to access that house or access that land. And that's exactly how platforms work. And that's exactly what platforms are doing to all kinds of things, right? With software, with Uber for X or X as a service. I mean, all of that is about controlling access to a good or service. And so I think we really have to understand that if we really want to know the operations of capital in this kind of analytical sense, if we want to understand how it's working and how it's developing, I don't think we need to look to feudalism. I don't think we need to call it an unjust form of capitalism. It definitely is, but it's because it's bringing us back to well-established relationships in capitalism, the landlord-rentier relationship, but now applying that much more widely to other things that before that kind of landlordism was not applied to.
Okay. The last two questions. The first one from Gabriel again. Would you talk a little bit about how you see the concept and practice of imperialism in the data-driven capitalism? And the second and last question, Jathan, which authors do you recommend for us to know better about technopolitics in capitalism?
So with the question of imperialism and data colonization, yeah, I mean, I think there's been some really great work on data colonialism coming out kind of simultaneously from geography, but also from media studies. And I think that's definitely part of it. I mean, I think that imperialist story is part of understanding how data capitalism or digital capitalism or platform capitalism, whatever we want to call it, what's happening now, we have to understand it through a form of imperialism and through a form of colonialism. And part of that is about what I talk about in the book is these kinds of imperatives of collection and control, of data capital, and expanding control over things and people and spaces. And in particular, we can see this, there was all these examples of like Facebook and Google, the Project Loon and things like that, and the Facebook Basics, which was this kind of like walled garden app that they were rolling out in India, for example, which are all just obviously ways to try to move into new markets and lock them into their services, so into Facebook's service or Google services, so that they can create new or collect new data, have new customers, right? Kind of, it's the imperialist story of moving to the fringes, moving to the margins from the imperial core in the search of new customers, new resources, and so on. That's definitely part of it. I think where this kind of data colonialism and kind of digital imperialism is perhaps happening the most and it's getting not a lot of attention, is in the agriculture sector. And we see this with the rise of precision agriculture, as it's called, and people like Alistair Fraser, who's a geography in Ireland at Maynooth University, has written some really awesome stuff in the Journal of Peasant Studies on precision agriculture and this kind of form of colonialism and imperialism that's being kind of transferred or expanded through the use of data and algorithms and software and all these digital technologies in the use of kind of new agricultural techniques, which are locking in farmers in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, using these new technologies, which promise to provide, more productive, kind of more gains, more outputs, and so on, more control over the growing and farming. But by doing so, they're locking them into these services, locking them into these systems that are owned by these massive conglomerates like Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, and these kind of massive multinational biotechnology and ag tech companies, while also dispossessing them of the data they create, but also control over the machinery that they rely on for their well-being and living. So this idea of colonialism and imperialism is definitely a crucial part of the story, and I think it's happening most egregiously in the agricultural sector, which makes sense. It's going back to that kind of early model of how to exploit the fringes, as from the imperial core. All right, now to the question of reading recommendations. I'll give a few people that have really impacted my work a lot and who I really enjoy, but I will also say that one of the things I really tried to do in my book is create a really comprehensive reference list, because I wanted that to be a resource as well. So, when you read a chapter in the book and you find it really interesting, flick back to the end of the book and look at all the references I have there. And there's heaps of, lots of journal articles, books, and news articles, journalism, just lots of references there to show you all of the people that are looking at these individual aspects in a much more in-depth kind of way. So do use my references as a resource. But as far as a few particular people for understanding the technopolitics of capitalism, I mean, one of the people who I would say immediately off the top of my head and really is Langdon Winner. So I've mentioned him before. His book, he's got two great books from a while ago, the 70s and 80s. One called Autonomous Technology. Is his first book, and his second book is called The Well and the Reactor. And Langdon Winner's work is just he's a pioneer of this idea of technopolitics. I really see my book Too Smart as a spiritual successor of Langdon Winner's work. I was really trying to do a kind of smart technology, digital capitalism version of what he did, 40 years ago in his work. So definitely look at Langdon Winner. As far as like understanding things like smart cities and what data means now, a kind of social science and social theory of data. Another person whose work really comes to mind is Rob Kitchen. So my PhD was on smart cities. I've done a lot of my research up until now has really focused on smart cities. And Rob Kitchen's work, he's a geographer at Maynooth University in Ireland, very prolific, and everything he writes is just fantastic. And his work has been immensely influential on my own understanding of what smart cities mean. And I always rely on his work to understand how data technologies or what new data technologies are being created, what it means, and how to think about it. I think that's really helpful as well. And I think a third person who I've also collaborated with and gives a different angle on a kind of more legal law and policy angle on the technopolitics of capitalism is Frank Pasquale. And I think many people here will be familiar with his work, his 2015 book, Black Box Society. He's got a new book coming out on automation. He's constantly writing, essays and blog posts that are just always really revelatory for me, and always, really opening my eyes to new ways of thinking about the law and policy angle of capitalism. His work is also really crucial. So if we take those three people, Langdon Winner on the kind of philosophy and theory of technopolitics, Rob Kitchen on the kind of geography and social science of data, and Frank Pasquale on the kind of policy and law of capitalism, of digital capitalism, you could do a lot worse than choosing those three people to understand what's going on in the world right now.
Okay, Jathan, thank you very much for having us today. And it's a great pleasure to having us in DigiLabour Conversations and in your website, DigiLabour too, with a great interview. E, gente, muito obrigado a todo mundo que esteve aí. Amanhã a gente estará de volta às 4 da tarde para conversar com o Antônio Casilli, autor de um livro A Espera dos Robôs, sobre o trabalho do clique. Ele falará conosco em inglês aqui mesmo no canal do YouTube do DigiLabour. Se você não assina ainda, ativa o sininho aí para você receber o aviso de quando a gente começar a live. Muito obrigado para quem acompanhou a gente até agora. E mais uma vez, muito obrigado ao Jathan por acordar tão cedo para falar conosco hoje. Thank you very much, Jathan. See you there.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me on DigiLabour Conversations.